Mark is a weapons expert renowned for developing weapons that consistently lead the global market. However, Mark is not fond of warfare. His primary intent in designing weapons is for deterrence and defense, not for piercing human bodies. One evening, his superior contacted him abruptly. The hyperspectral goggles Mark had developed were now being used on the Eastern European battlefield. Recently, special forces equipped with these goggles had captured some bizarre images. The general wanted Mark to head to Eastern Europe immediately to investigate, though he was reluctant to disclose what had been captured. The next morning, Mark arrived in Moldova, Eastern Europe, aboard a private jet. The situation in this region was highly complex, with the U.S. supporting the government forces and Russia backing the rebels. It was less of a civil war within Moldova and more a proxy military confrontation between two superpowers. General Orend, who received Mark, explained that over the past 3 weeks, soldiers had repeatedly captured images of a mysterious white shadow. Initially dismissed as signal interference, the phenomenon took a troubling turn with the most recent observations. A few days earlier, Squad U had been dispatched on a raid, during which one member lost contact. This member was a veteran of 3 wars, a top elite, yet his death had been instantaneous. The general, while speaking, showed the footage from the final moments of the deceased member. Through his goggles, the man had seen a white shadow appear before him. The moment the shadow made contact, the soldier collapsed, ceasing to breathe instantly. This mysterious method of death allowed no time for reflection. Subsequently, numerous bodies were discovered in the city with similar causes of death. Their internal organs were frozen, while their skins showed burn marks. Autopsies yielded no conclusions, only speculations from some children who called these white shadows phantoms, supposedly spirits from local ancient legends. The CIA initially speculated that this might be an enemy stealth technology involving invisibility suits, used to kill targets before they could react. Mark immediately dismissed this hypothesis. The U.S. Department of Defense was also developing stealth technology, holding the most advanced levels in the world. Yet it was still years from completion. How could anyone else be further ahead? Moreover, even if the enemy did use invisibility suits, how would that explain the methods of death by freezing and burning? To draw accurate conclusions, more data was needed. But first, clearer images were essential. Mark brought a hyperspectral camera from the U.S. and mounted it on a Delta Force armored vehicle. Although the camera was powerful, it was also complex to operate. Therefore, Mark decided to join the Delta Force team himself. The mission had 2 objectives: to rescue any surviving members and capture a Phantom for study if possible. The operation began, and 5 armored vehicles boldly entered the combat zone, heading for the location where Squad U had last made contact. Dozens of commandos, fully armed, entered the mission area, while Mark, Fran from the CIA, and the team captain stayed inside the armored vehicle to monitor the images from the soldiers' goggles. Before long, the soldiers discovered a faint blue light under a bathtub. Suspecting a phantom might be hiding there, they cautiously approached and lifted the bathtub, finding a surviving member of Squad U inside, who was severely tortured but still lucid. He reported that his squad had been wiped out, and the perpetrator was not human but something resembling a drifting, frozen blanket. Simultaneously, a 4-man team reached the top floor, where they found the bodies of Squad U members. While searching, a white shadow suddenly appeared in a corner. Strangely, when the soldiers removed their goggles, they saw nothing. Mark realized that the phantom they were seeking had appeared. He ordered the soldiers to open fire, but inexplicably, the bullets passed through the white shadow and hit the wall. In the next second, the white shadow struck a soldier's face, killing him instantly. The captain, sensing the danger, ordered the soldiers into combat readiness, determined to take down this entity, but they hadn't anticipated the phantom's attack speed. In the blink of an eye, 6 soldiers were killed. If they continued, they might all be wiped out. So Mark instructed everyone to retreat immediately. It was too late to return the way they had come. They had to rappel down from the 5th floor window. However, a few slower-moving soldiers were caught and killed by the pursuing white shadows. This might have been the only chance to capture the phantom. So Mark emerged from the armored vehicle and used the hyperspectral camera to capture a clear image of the white shadow. However, the scene in the image shocked him speechless. It wasn't any invisibility suit, but an energy being with a human-like appearance. To cover the members' retreat, the captain fired a rocket at the phantom's location, but physical attacks had no effect on it. It charged forward and killed the captain. Using the brief time the captain had bought, the people scrambled into the armored vehicle and left. But this was just the beginning of the nightmare. They hadn't gone far before hitting a bomb planted by the rebels, and the remaining 2 armored vehicles were also blown over. The loud explosion likely attracted the rebels, and without time to assess their injuries, They took their weapons and camera and hid in a nearby factory. Their communication equipment was destroyed in the explosion, making it impossible to contact headquarters. Fortunately, Mark's hyperspectral camera was still functional. They set up the equipment at a high point and saw several phantoms approaching, but they stopped at the doorway, blocked by some metal scraps. It seemed that phantoms also had weaknesses. Fran then noticed another detail: someone had deliberately scattered metal scraps around the house, likely the work of rebels. The team immediately began a thorough search, suspecting rebels might be hiding there. Soon, the team found a room where they could faintly hear a tape recorder, but when they burst in fully armed, they found only 2 children inside. The good news was that there was a radio in the communication room next door. They could use it to call for help from headquarters, although there was a risk of eavesdropping by the rebels. That was now the least of their worries. The 2 children, a brother and sister, were civilians from Moldova. After confirming that the soldiers meant no harm, the siblings gradually relaxed their guard. Fran asked them whose idea it was to use metal scraps to block the phantoms. The sister said it was their father's idea, but he was killed by the spirits shortly after setting up the barrier. Mark was curious. How had their father known this secret? The sister replied that their father worked at the Masarovi plant, where the killings by ghosts had begun. Moldova had once invested billions in weapons research. Perhaps the phantoms were a weapon they had developed, although he was unclear why they maintained a human form. Mark knew that if they were energy beings, they could be dissolved. This was an unchanging law of nature. Mark was a weapons expert, skilled in finding weaknesses and creating corresponding weapons. He had tested a plasma discharge gun in the lab, a weapon that could dissolve condensates. Although resources were now scarce, by gathering all electronic and optical devices, they could still manufacture a batch of discharge guns. Once the weapons were developed, they could head straight for Masarovi to stop it before the situation worsened. Hearing this news was like a shot of adrenaline for everyone. They immediately sprang into action. The general brought back a mechanical dog from the base, onto which Mark installed a searchlight. It could serve as a scout to locate the phantoms. Mark also modified everyone's weapons, turning them into discharge guns that fired focused energy pulses. If nothing went wrong, they could melt the phantoms just like melting ice. Masarovi was the largest nuclear power plant in the area, with a highly complex spatial structure. Although they now had weapons, completely eliminating the phantoms was impossible. Their plan was to use a diversionary tactic. The commandos would draw the phantoms out. Then Mark and Fran would take the opportunity to enter the power plant, where there must be a way to resolve the issue. Once all preparations were complete, the group boarded the remaining 5 transport aircraft and headed for Masarovi. They were using untested weapons, so only the first squad landed on the platform. When the searchlight illuminated the area ahead, a phantom appeared in their sight. The soldiers immediately set up their weapons and fired an energy pulse at the phantom as it charged. As Mark had predicted, the low-temperature phantom melted instantly upon encountering the super high-temperature energy pulse. Now that the weapons were proven effective, other squads joined the battle. Mark and Fran, covered by their teammates, landed in the courtyard of the nuclear power plant, the closest entry to the interior. Shortly after entering, Mark discovered a lab with many images and a 3D printer. They had been using molecular-level technology to scan humans and then print the phantoms using a condensate printer. The place was like an automatic assembly line, producing the world's most terrifying weapons. Next, the two entered a larger room with countless phantoms in cages, some of which had already escaped, likely the cause of the disaster. In the center of the room was a huge console, but the operating instructions were all in Russian. Fran struggled to decipher a phrase: disconnect all ports, shut down the program. The so-called ports were the cables connecting the console to the phantoms, but there were over a dozen of these, each requiring specialized tools to disconnect. Before Mark could act, the phantoms in the cages became agitated, and it was only a matter of time before they broke out. Mark didn't have time to worry. He grabbed the tools and climbed up, while Fran protected him with a stun gun. Using all his strength, Mark finally disconnected all the ports, but the phantoms showed no change. Fran loudly reminded him that he must pull the central lever for the ports to be completely disconnected. The threatened phantoms became even more agitated, and the glass trapping them began to crack. On the other side, the commandos had cleared all the phantoms on the ground. Just as they were about to rest, the melted phantoms suddenly began to gather and gradually formed a massive phantom storm. Ordinary discharge guns were no longer effective. The commander knew that continuing to fight was a dead end, so he connected 7 pulse cannons together and fired a super strong energy pulse. Although the phantom storm was blasted apart, the huge explosion also shattered the last barrier of the cages, and countless phantoms rushed toward Mark. Just at this critical moment, Mark successfully pulled the lever, and the phantom army dissipated like smoke. The plan had succeeded. Mark and Fran prepared to leave the place, but they inadvertently entered another lab. The scene in front of them shocked them to the core. The room was filled with life support devices, but inside were not bodies but nerves extracted from living people, which were controlling the phantoms. These people were not alive but also not completely dead. They were trapped between life and death. No wonder the phantoms attacked humans on sight. They were actually venting their anger at humanity. Mark couldn't explain all this scientifically, but he could feel their pain. So, he took it upon himself to shut down all the life support machines, allowing the deceased to rest in peace as the greatest respect for life.